thanks very much. I'm honored to be here, and thanks everybody for sticking around for the last talk for a 3-day conference. That's really dedicated, so I'm very grateful that you stuck around for this. And thanks again for this wonderful conference. I mean, the organizers did a wonderful job. So I've been having a great time and learning a lot. Okay, so today what I wanted to talk about is something that I've sort of been thinking about on and off for a number of years. So many years ago, I wrote an essay in which I argued that there was a category of action that I called the subarrogatory, and these are actions which are morally bad in some respect, but they're not impermissible, so they don't violate any obligations. But I nevertheless thought that they were blameworthy, or at least some of them could be blameworthy. So all I need is that some of them are blameworthy, actually. They don't all have to be blameworthy, okay? If this is the case, right, and I'll try to make a case for these, instances later, that poses a potential issue for certain accounts of blame and wrongdoing. So specifically the ones I'm concerned with are the ones put forward by Dana Nelken and Stephen Darwall, mainly Stephen Darwall, because he has like this more worked out second personal address system that I think is kind of interesting, and it sort of gives me more to sink my teeth into, so to speak. But anyway, so Darwall, as well as Nelken, they hold the view that blame is only apt when the action being blamed is wrong, okay? And that for an action to be wrong, it must be blameworthy. Okay, so they hold a thesis that I've identified on the handout as BW. An action is blameworthy if and only if the action is wrong, barring excuses. Okay. And Darwall holds that this is a conceptual truth about blame and wrongdoing. So he's making like a really, really strong claim. Okay. Now, this seemed very implausible to me, right? And I've had some conversations with Steve, in fact, one not too long ago, like a little over a month ago, about this very topic. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how what he has to say in response. I have kind of a response to it myself, but he wants to say that in this particular, claim, BW, he's talking about a very specific sort of blaming response, right? And blameworthiness, okay? And that is, the person is blameworthy in the sense of holding accountable, right? Not simply in the sense of I'm making a negative, judgment about the person, okay? Now, I want to say that's fine, and I take that on board, and that's nevertheless what I'm talking about when I'm attacking this claim, okay? So there may be lots of different senses of what it is to be blameworthy, different ways in which people can be blameworthy. That's fine, but I'm talking about I am holding that person accountable in these cases. That's the form I'm talking about, right? Okay. So anyway, this conceptual truth claim leaves no space for subarrogatory actions. That is, actions that are not wrong because they violated no obligation, but are blameworthy, or at least some of them are blameworthy. So subarrogatory actions are the negative contrast to the supererogatory actions. That is, actions that are not required, but are admirable, right? And at least some of them are praiseworthy. Now, when I first presented this, I wasn't really committing myself to the existence of the subarrogatory. I mean, I do think that they exist. But the main point that I wanted to make is that if you're on board with the supererogatory, right, maybe you don't think there are supererogatory actions, but if you do think that there are supererogatory actions, then you should be on board with the subarrogatory, okay, this contrast class, right? Okay. Now, what are some examples? Well, I put two of my examples on the handout. So one is kidney transplant, which was actually referred to a little bit earlier. And this is actually based on a real case I read about in the newspapers, so it actually happened. So suppose that Louis and Albert are twin brothers, and Albert is suffering from kidney failure and needs a new kidney within 2 weeks or he will die. The only compatible donor is his brother Louis. Louis feels bad about Albert's circumstances, but refuses to donate his kidney and Albert dies. Okay, so that's one case, right? And then the second case is Subway. Madeline has had a very difficult day at the office and is very tired. As she steps onto the subway on the way home, she sees that there's only one seat available on the opposite side of the car from the door. She takes that seat and relaxes. At the next stop, an elderly person gets on the subway. The person sitting in the seat close to the door, that's the person who should get up and give their seat up, right? Doesn't do it, doesn't give up their seat, right? So Alice feels some pressure to offer the person her seat, but decides not to do so she can get some extra rest. Okay, right. I just want to tell you that I did get up and give the person my seat. So anyway, I did not do the subrogatory thing, but anyway, so what sort of characterizes these cases? Well, intuitively, these are cases where people have certain entitlements that they don't want to give up. Okay, I'm not talking just about legal entitlements, but moral entitlements. Okay, it's my kidney. I am the boss of my kidney, right? And nobody can demand of me that I give my kidney up to them, right? They don't have that authority, moral authority to do that, let alone legal authority, right? And similarly, in the subway case, there were seats set aside for the elderly. The people that were supposed to get up didn't get up. It's first come, first serve for all the other seats. I'm tired, so I have some reason to keep my seat. It's true, the elderly person probably needs it more than I do, right? But nevertheless, I'm entitled to that seat. And I can decide, I have, it's within my sort of, the scope of my normative powers, so to speak, to decide whether or not to give it up. Okay, and there's certainly a sense in which I should give it up, okay, in which Madeline should give up that seat, right? But it's not a sense in which, I argue, it's not a sense in which somebody can demand of her that she do that. Okay. Now, many of these cases, I think, can be described as individuals, who are standing on their rights when the balance of moral reasons really suggests they ought not to do that. Okay? So a person stands on her rights when she refuses, for example, to waive the right, either in virtue of insisting that a right be respected, when there's a presumption that the right will be waived, or in virtue of asserting a right that might not have been salient to others, right? So both of these cases, I think, can be analyzed along those lines, right? So in the kidney transplant, I'm standing on, Louis is standing on the right he has, right, to keep his kidney, right? He's entitled to that. Madeline is standing on her right, okay, to keep the seat. First come, first serve, all right? Now, I don't think that all cases of the subrogatory are analyzable in these ways, right? But I do think that in a lot of cases, that really is what's going on, is people are standing on their rights, okay? And if you've got a right to that thing, a moral right to it, then you're not doing anything wrong when you deny somebody access to it, okay? You might be doing something bad, right? And it might nevertheless be blameworthy, but it's not something that's morally wrong. You're not engaged in wrongdoing, okay? Now, of course, I'm just going to make an obvious point. Standing on your rights is often a very good thing to do, right? So if some bully gets on the subway and demands of Madeline that she give up her seat, standing on her right to keep that seat, that's a good thing, right? So the cases that I'm talking about here are just cases where the balance of moral reasons cuts against you doing that, right? Okay. So why hold that such actions are apt for blame if they don't involve any wrongdoing? Okay, so here what I want to do is remain fairly ecumenical. So I'm assuming several things about blame, I think, which aren't terribly controversial. So first, when I'm blaming somebody, that involves them making a judgment that they've engaged in a kind of moral or normative failure of some sort. Okay, so and I do, that is the case. There is a normative failure. There's a moral failure, right? It's just not a failure to meet a demand. It's some other kind of moral failure, which we'll talk about in more detail. Okay. I also am going to assume in this paper too, right? So I'm also going to kind of assume a quality of the will approach. So broadly speaking, I think that that's the right approach. I'm extraordinarily expansive about what counts as having a poor will, okay? So, as I brought up with one of the other, I actually do think that sometimes just an absence of a bad will constitutes a good will in some situations, right? So that means that there's not necessarily even anything positive going on in the person's mind. So I'm going to be very expansive about this, but there's got to be some, in order for the person to be blameworthy, there has to be some poor quality of the will. Okay. All right. Another thing I want to assume in my argument about blame is that it involves a negative reactive attitude. Okay, though the attitude need not be occurrent at the time the blame takes place. So for example, I do think, I agree with Jay that that the sanctioning element in blame, so in the case of blame, you've got that judgment of norm violation, and then there's also this sanctioning element. And the sanctioning element is going to be a hostile reactive attitude, let's say anger or resentment. Okay? But I don't think, and I'm sure he might very well agree with me on this, I don't think it has to be occurrent at the time you are blaming the person. So, for example, the cases that I was interested in were cases where, like your deadbeat cousin, like probably everybody's got at least one deadbeat cousin, and, this guy comes to you, borrows, so I need some money for, to fix my car. I will pay you back next month when I get paid. You give them the money to fix their car, they don't pay you back, and then you're angry with them, right? You get mad at them, right? They do this a second time, they do it a third time, they do it a fourth time. You're not mad at them anymore, right? After like the fifth time maybe, or the 10th time, however long it takes. Right? It's just sort of, you just don't have it in you to be mad at them anymore, okay? But the fact is, there's still you're still prone to anger at these sorts of violations, and that's still present. Okay, so that I think that things like that have to be present in order for there to be a genuine blaming response going on. Other cases that have interested me are cases where the person they are maybe they're suffering from clinical depression and they have anhedonia, for example. They just don't get emotional at all, really, anymore because of their depression. And suppose that, suppose I'm depressed and I find out that my accountant has, taken all my money and run away to the Bahamas, right? And I'm just sitting there in my living room. I can't get mad. I can't feel much of anything, right? But I do, think to myself, this guy did something wrong. What a jerk, I hope a rock falls on him or something like that. And it seems like I'm blaming him, right? And I also realize, of course, that if I were feeling normal, I would be really angry with him, right? I know that that's the right way for me to feel in these circumstances, is to be angry with them. So there you've still got the disposition to anger. That's present. It's just that it's been masked by a clinical condition of some sort. Okay, so I do fall into the category of people who think there does have to be that connection to the hostile reactive attitudes, and that's the relevant sanction that we're talking about. And I want to kind of explain away some of the problem cases in the ways that I've just described to you. Okay. All right. But again, I don't think of these the assumptions I'm making as incredibly controversial. Okay. Now, somebody who wants to, so here what I've done is I've presented a claim about the connection between blame and wrongdoing. right? I've presented what I take to be counterexamples to that claim, right? Now I'm trying to put myself in the position of somebody who wants to defend BW, who wants to defend that claim. So what are they going to say to me? Okay. Well, one thing they could say, right, is, that they could argue that all of the actions I've described here, they really are wrong, right? It is morally wrong to not give your kidney to your brother, right? Your brother is entitled to that kidney. He has a right to it, and it's a moral right to it. Okay, now we can argue about legal rights, but he's got a moral right to it, and it's wrong for you to not give it to him, right? Similarly, if Madeline doesn't give up the seat, she's also done something morally wrong. Not as serious, as in the kidney case, but still it's morally wrong, right? Okay. And to me, that seems to run against some significant moral phenomenology, all right? So if you want to take that route, because one of the weird things about some of these cases, and again, I don't think this characterizes all subrogatory things I want to call subrogatory actions, but it characterizes some of them, is that a lot of times the situation that you find yourself in where you might perform one of these actions is a situation where you don't have like any morally neutral place to land, so to speak, right? So let's say Lewis does donate the kidney to his brother. You are like the best brother ever, right? That is so great, Lewis, It's treated as though it were supererogatory, right? You really went above and beyond, Lewis. Wonderful brother, right? Lots of praise, okay? And that seems like a weird thing to do if you think that he was morally obligated to do it, okay? So I don't find that strategy all that attractive. Although I do grant that there are ways that you can deal with this phenomenology and explain it away, okay? But this isn't the strategy I'm really going to focus on in the talk today, but that is one possible strategy that somebody could, use to try to get out of this and just say, look, all of these cases that I say are subrogatory, they're actually wrong, okay? And so that's why they're blameworthy. We have a good explanation for why they're blameworthy. Now, another strategy, though, is to say that the subrogatory actions are not wrong, but then they're not really blameworthy either, okay? So, Lewis didn't do anything wrong, right, when he didn't donate his kidney to his brother, but he's not blameworthy either, okay? Similarly, Madeline didn't do anything wrong, but she's not blameworthy either. And that seems kind of weird because it looks like, well, I would be a little upset, if my brother didn't donate a kidney and I ended up dying because of that. And I imagine, the elderly woman might resent Madeline slightly, maybe a little bit, for not giving up the seat, okay? So you have to try to explain away why it seems that there's something, something like blame is apt in these circumstances. And one thing that people tend to reach for is moral criticism. Okay, so the argument is, well, it's not blame, but it's moral criticism. Okay. All right. So this maneuver has been employed in other debates, okay, making a distinction between blaming somebody versus morally criticizing them to solve various other problems. And so, one example is in this classic article called Involuntary Sins, in which Robert Adams has argued that we can be blameworthy for certain attitudes and emotions that we hold, even though we have no direct control over them, okay? And some people disagree with that because they think you can't be held responsible for, you can't be blamed for something that you really had no control over. And, like if I don't know, like suppose that, suppose I see somebody trip and then I just instantly have this feeling like of contempt for them, okay? That's not something I can control. It just sort of like happened, right? So how can I be criticized for that, or I shouldn't say criticized. How can I be blamed for that? Or it'd be inappropriate to blame me for that. Now maybe you could blame me for other stuff, like if I display my contempt reaction to them or something like that, right? Which I do have control over, perhaps, right? Um, um, but there are a lot of people who think that something like contempt, nevertheless, is, I mean, some people think it's always blameworthy, actually. Like there's a really hardcore sort of strand of Kantian ethics which holds that it's always blameworthy to feel contempt under, any circumstances whatsoever. But anyway, there are a lot of people who do think that you can nevertheless be blameworthy for these emotions that you have, even though you have no direct control over them. And of course, this is a super hot topic now, especially in epistemology when it comes to responsibility for beliefs, for example. How can I be responsible? Something strikes me a certain way, how is it blameworthy if it strikes me that way? I don't have any control over that, right? Okay, same kind of issue. So in any case, critics have responded by saying that, look, you can't be blamed for this, but you can be criticized morally, right? I can be criticized morally for my feeling, these inappropriate feelings that I might have, right? I should feel pity and compassion for somebody, but instead I have this, morally problematic reaction to their misfortune, okay? And this is what Adams writes, and I have to say I'm very sympathetic with Adams. This was like, when I first sort of heard this response, I said, well, but I want to know what the difference between moral criticism and blame is. I mean, I'm not, what exactly is the difference? And so he wrote, to me it seems strange to say that I do not blame someone, though I think poorly of him, believing that his motives are thoroughly selfish. Intuitively, I should have said that thinking poorly of a person in this way is a form of unspoken blame. I'm not sure, however, that there is only a verbal dispute here about the use of the word blame. Blaming is a type of response to faults in oneself or in others. So there may be some substantive disagreement about how it is appropriate to treat us in view of our involuntary faults. Okay. And so what he ends up arguing, of course, is that persons who exhibit these involuntary sins, these sort of emotional responses, right, should not be like punished or anything, but they're still apt for reproach and blame. Okay. I had a colleague once also who did something similar, saying that, well, there's blame and then there's condemnation, right? So I blame you, right? For stuff that you have control over, or maybe I blame you for doing the wrong thing. But there are other things that I can condemn you for, right? And again, I find this very mysterious. So if other people have like a way of understanding why this isn't blame, like what is it? I mean, it seems like it's got all the ingredients of blame. So I'm not sure exactly what the distinction consists in. Okay. Well, a similar maneuver was made in distinguishing accountability from attributability in the moral responsibility literature. So when I attribute a vice to someone, Gary Watson would hold, I don't thereby hold them accountable, right? So perhaps what's going on is that when someone performs a subrogatory action, we don't hold them accountable since they haven't wronged anyone, though we do criticize them by in effect attributing a vice to them. The action then has this sort of evidential significance, right? I can see that this guy's a jerk, right? Look at what he did. He's a jerk, okay? Now, again, my response to this is I do think that it's true that we sometimes do really merely attribute a vice to somebody without also holding them accountable. I mean, I do think that does happen sometimes. But this won't speak to the sorts of cases I discuss here, the subrogatory cases, where it seems to me like when I look at, when somebody looks at Lewis and they say, Lewis is like a jerk, they're not just saying that Lewis is a jerk. They're saying Lewis did a really jerky thing, right? That thing that Lewis did was appalling, So it's not just the character trait, but it's the action that they're evaluating, right? And they're bringing in, what's most important is they're bringing the full range of reactive attitudes, to bear there, okay? All right. Okay. Now, that's not to say that I don't think a distinction can be made. I do think a distinction can be made, and I think this is super interesting, and I know that there are people working on this now, and I haven't been able to keep up with the literature that much, but I know Susan Wolf has written something on this. But there is a distinction to be made between blame and moral criticism, okay? So for example, like if one of your friends does something wrong, like maybe they lose their temper or something, right? And you might take them aside and say something like, really you should have not done that, right? I mean, and maybe you should work on anger management issues and stuff like that, right? And so that's a way of like giving somebody advice, sort of moral advice. It involves criticizing them because they did do something wrong, right? But you're not blaming them because there's no sanctioning element. If anything, you're trying, to not sanction them at all, right? So I do think that there is a distinction there to be made. But again, that's not something that's going to help in these sorts of cases, right? I'm not, when I get mad at Lewis and I yell at him, I'm not giving him advice, right, about what to do, to clean up his act. I mean, maybe that's part of what I'm doing, but certainly not the full, that doesn't exhaust everything that I'm doing. Okay. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to do was so I don't think that strategy is going to work. But one of the things I wanted to do recently, too, was try to expand on what is going on with these subrogatory actions. Like in my original project, I didn't really go into this in very much detail. But I think that what's going on is that in the case of subrogatory actions, what we have, again, at least in a lot of them, is we have a violation of a normative expectation. And I want to say a mere normative expectation. Okay. Now, there's been a lot of discussion of Strawson at this conference. So I have a little Strawson quote in here, okay? So from Freedom and Resentment, Peter Strawson notes that the personal reactive attitudes rest on and reflect an expectation of, and the italics is me, I'm adding that, that's not in the text, okay? The personal reactive attitudes rest on and reflect an expectation of and demand for the manifestation of a certain degree of goodwill or regard on the part of other human beings towards ourselves, or at least on the expectation of and demand for an absence of the manifestation of active ill will or indifferent disregard, right? So Strawson actually does have the absence in there as something that would, count. Absences are relevant too. So what's going on there? Well, he talks in terms of expectations and demands, right? Expectations and demands. Now, everybody I've talked to about Strawson, who's a Strawson expert, says he just means the same thing. That's just what it is. There's no difference between a normative expectation and a normative demand that's being made. Those are both the same thing, okay? However, a distinction can be made between the two, okay? And I'm not the only person thinking along these lines. Like a lot of other people have been thinking that perhaps that there are normative expectations that are not demanding, okay? The sort of ones that I'm interested in especially are ones that arise in our relationships with other people, okay? And I also think that those are the ones that are of particular interest to people working in moral responsibility, okay? So again, a mere normative expectation is not a demand, okay? In violating mere normative expectations, an agent can be blameworthy vis-a-vis that relationship, even though they have not acted wrongly. Okay, so, well, what are these things? Well, first of all, normative expectations are not predictive. So when we talk about normative expectations, we're not talking about psychological states. We're not talking about predictions. So for example, I have a normative expectation of my son that he do his fair share of the dishes. I am not predicting that he's going to do his fair share of the dishes. Okay, I don't predict, I don't predict that at all. Okay, but having that normative expectation, if there really is this normative expectation, then that entitles me to engage in, blame, right? If he fails to live up to the normative expectation, then I can blame him for it. Right? And that's true whether or not I actually expect him to do it. Okay. Another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about normative expectations, and this is something I didn't really know how to describe and talk about very clearly, but I hope I can get the basic idea across, is that we need to distinguish between descriptive normative expectations and genuine normative expectations. Okay, so for example, right, in ancient Sumer, it may have been a normative expectation of slaves that they sort of fling themselves on the ground and abase themselves before their masters, right? So if we were to travel back in time and go to I got this idea from Gideon Rosen's paper, by the way. So anyway, if we were to go back in time and live in that society, it would have been a normative expectation that people had. I'm talking in this descriptive sense. People had that this is what slaves do, right? They, if your slave doesn't fling himself on the ground and abase himself, then, you're entitled to punish him, right? He's violating this normative expectation. Okay. That's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about normative expectations. That's just in this purely kind of descriptive sense. This is what people expected in this ancient society, right? So what I'm interested in are genuine normative expectations, okay? What are the genuine norms that these are going to be expectations that arise out of genuine relationship norms, right? Reflecting the way relationships really ought to be, okay? Not the way they are, but the way they ought to be, okay? All right, so it seems to me, and again, I'm happy to see what your intuitions are about these sorts of cases, but it seems to me that some relationship norms simply cannot be demanding, okay? And thus, some of the normative expectations that arise out of these relationship norms cannot be demanding, okay? And I'm thinking in particular norms that arise in loving relationships, family relationships, those sorts of things. So, so this is an example that sort of, I was inspired by some of the examples that David Shoemaker talks about. But suppose that a person is entitled to expect that their spouse will remember their birthday and make special plans accordingly. Okay, right? If that expectation is disappointed, it seems like that person would be entitled to blame the spouse in virtue of the violation of an important relationship norm or normative expectation. However, respecting the norm is not something that is rightly understood as meeting a demand, since it seems to me that would be self-defeating, right? So, so what I have in mind is something like this, and I'm not maybe putting it that clearly, but I cannot demand of my husband that he care enough about me to remember my birthday, right? No, you can't? No, I can't. I don't think so. That's not what to me, it seems self-defeating, right? It seems like, it's sort of like this idea, like if my husband gives me like $50 and says, go buy your birthday present, it's like, you got to pick it out. It's got to come from your heart. It's got to be all that. All that's got to be there, Otherwise, it just doesn't count, So to me, so I have this strong intuition that this sort of normative expectation is really important in relationships, but it can't be demanded without being self-defeating in some way, right? It's just pointless. It's pointless to demand it, right? Anyway, that's my intuition, okay, right? And so I think that subrogatory actions will involve these violation of non-demanding normative expectations, okay? Non-demanding normative expectations. Now, you know, we can talk about this later. I mean, one thing that you guys could say is that, well, okay, I sort of see the relationship stuff. Okay, maybe there are some normative expectations that are non-demanding and they're really important, you know, and so forth. But I don't think all the cases that you're talking about when it comes to subrogatory, but that doesn't sort of vindicate what you have to say about the subrogatory specifically, right? So that's one possible thing that you could say. We might talk about that a bit later. Okay. All right. Anyway, so that's what I think is underlying the subrogatory, okay? That there are these violations of non-demanding normative expectations, okay? And I was, you know, thinking during some of the presentations at the conference that this might in some way be helpful to some people. So for example, when we were talking about praise, right? Praise can't be demanded as a matter of justice. No, it can't be demanded as a matter of justice, right? That's definitely true. But maybe there are certain normative expectations that arise with respect to praise. That's a possibility, right? They're not demanding, but nevertheless, if you fail to praise somebody, it might be something that you could be criticized for, you could be blamed for, right? Even though it's not something that can be demanded as a matter of justice. You know, so for example, the cases that I was thinking of were cases like if, you know, I've got 2 children, right, and I praise one for getting an A, but I don't praise the other one for getting an A or something like that, or, you know, there seems like there are situations in which it would be kind of bad for me to not praise somebody. All right. Another thing where it's relevant, and I'm not going to talk about it so much today, but I will be talking about it at the next conference I go to in Gothenburg, is the relevance for gratitude, right? So, you know, gratitude can't be demanded. Nevertheless, you know, it looks like there's a normative expectation of gratitude if you benefit somebody, if you're somebody's benefactor, right? So you're still blameworthy if you fail to display gratitude, okay? So I think this is a pretty useful category, basically, right? Useful category of action. Okay, so what could somebody else say about these cases? Well, another person who's written on this general topic is Adrienne Martin. She wrote a really nice paper called Personal Bonds, and she addressed some of my work as well as the work of Cheshire Calhoun in that article. And she maintains that cases like the kidney transplant case that I just talked about are best understood as involving directed obligations without any corresponding rights. So in other words, there might be an obligation to do something, right? But to do something for somebody, but that person doesn't have a right to it. So that person can't make a demand in that sense, understood relative to having a right to the thing, okay? So on that analysis, Lewis does have an obligation to his brother to give him the kidney, right? But his brother can't demand it as a matter of right because his brother doesn't have a right to it. That's the idea there, right? So, which I find puzzling myself, but I think it's an interesting idea. Okay. Now she views directed obligations as involving exclusionary reasons. So these are reasons introduced by Joseph Raz, not to consider other reasons. Okay. Let's see, okay, there we go. Right, to not consider other reasons. So, for example, if I'm really exhausted and my stockbroker calls to discuss investment strategies, it's probably not a good idea for me to consider his reasons at that point since I'm not in a position to really absorb them, right? Okay. Thus, I have an exclusionary reason to not consider these reasons at that time, because I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to be prone to making mistakes at that time if I do consider those reasons. Okay. So Martin applies this to the case involving someone who's a directed obligation to attend his daughter's music recitation or recital. Okay. This person has reason to not consider various alternatives in his practical deliberations, things like I could use a good nap, right? Or I could get a lot of work done instead, right? Not supposed to think about those things. That's the idea. Okay. But she wants to say the daughter does not have a right for her father to go to the music recital either. Okay. He's got an obligation, but she doesn't have a right. Okay. Right. She can't go to him and issue a demand, right? So, so these are not reasons in the given context. They cannot be used as a justification for failing to attend, although in other contexts they are perfectly good reasons. I could use a nap as a good reason for taking a nap, right? So they ought not to be considered in the first place. That person has reason to exclude them. This, on her view, is a sign that the father has a genuine obligation to attend, even if his daughter does not have a moral right to her father attending. Okay. Now, this use of exclusionary reasons I think is interesting, but I don't think it establishes I'm not convinced that it establishes what she wants it to establish, primarily because it needs to be independently argued that when I ought to exclude certain reasons from my practical deliberations, this demonstrates that I thereby have a moral obligation to perform the action that these reasons do not fully justify. This is because someone who disagreed with her analysis could agree that one ought not to consider certain reasons because people that do so are shallow, or because these reasons don't fully justify failure to go to the recital and will tempt one away from doing what a good father would do, and so forth, right? So I just don't think that, it might be a kind of consideration in favor of that view of establishing that there's an obligation, but it's not I don't think it's like a knockdown argument for that. Okay. All right. Okay, so again, on her view, Lewis does not have an obligation to donate his kidney to Al, or he does have an obligation, okay, and is acting wrongly when he fails to do so. However, Albert does not have a right to the kidney, and the kidney cannot be demanded. Okay. Now, one thing that she herself notes in the essay is that her account doesn't really handle all cases of the subrogatory. So she explicitly says, for example, it's not going to handle the subway case very well. She can't really handle that case. So, at best what she's going to get is this ability to handle some of the cases, right? But not all of the cases. Okay. All right. Now, one of the things that I find interesting, and I was really grateful for the talk today that actually brought this issue up, right, is it maybe that there's an issue in how to understand what constitutes a demand, right? Right, what constitutes a demand? It seems to be ambiguous. And this is just something I personally have to think about a lot more for my larger project, okay? So on the one hand, someone like Darwall, who adopts the second personal approach, or second personal stance, when it comes to holding responsible, seems committed to a view of demands in which one person makes a demand of another in holding accountable. Like that's like the paradigm central sort of case, right? Like I stand before you and I demand of you that you treat me with respect, right? I demand an attitude of respect, okay? And so this is like so really one of my, my main target is somebody like Darwall who has that really strong claim about the connection between blame and wrongdoing. And so for the purposes of this paper, this is the sense in which I hold that mere normative expectations are not demanding. Okay, it's not appropriate to go up and issue that demand in these cases. Okay. Now, but there might be other senses of demand that people are working with. There might be other ways of understanding what a demand is. Now, one I think is interesting for other reasons, not because I think necessarily that it's going to help me so much with this particular project, but in talking to people, especially when it comes to sort of the context of discussing what goes on in relationships, like specifically sort of interactions that occur within certain relationships, one might view a relationship demand as something like either a necessary condition for the relationship in question or as a condition that represents a potential deal breaker for the relationship. And in fact, these conditions could come in varying strengths. So in this reading, then, consider some of Hallie Liberto's cases regarding sexual demands. So she believes that sexual fidelity itself cannot be demanded. Okay, first of all, I want to make this absolutely clear. I do not agree with Hallie Liberto on this issue, okay? I do not. This is just an example. But I've given this paper before at places, and they thought that I was agreeing with Hallie Liberto. I am not agreeing with her. I do think it can be demanded. I'm sorry. And I do, in fact, demand it for my husband. So there you go. Anyway, okay, so she believes that sexual fidelity itself cannot be demanded. This, I believe, rests on the first understanding of demand, right? However, this might be true, and yet a person who is not faithful might have thereby failed to meet a key condition for a certain sort of relationship. Perhaps like traditional spouse, for example. Okay, so in that sense, they violated a relationship demand, right? It's a separate question as to how the strength of the demand is to be understood, of course, Maybe they simply aren't in the relationship anymore. Maybe I just say, look, that's it. We're not, there's just no, I thought we had this relationship, but I was wrong. We don't, okay? Or maybe they simply remain in the relationship. Maybe the truth is that there still is that relationship, but they've done something for which their spouse has grounds to sever or otherwise modify or renegotiate the terms of the relationship, right? I have no opinion on that, but those are different ways people could go. Okay, let's just see how much. Okay, so I think that the idea that one can be blameworthy in virtue of violating serious relationship norms that are not demands could be applied to other puzzles. And so now what I'm going to do is really just wildly speculate, okay? You may have thought everything I did so far was wild speculation anyway, but now I'm really going to do wild speculation, okay? But it's got kind of a perversity that I like, and people who are familiar with my work know that I like weird stuff, so just kind of go along with this a little bit. Okay, so one such puzzle has to do with how it seems. So here I'm talking about a case. I actually wrote an article about this a long time ago. And it's a case that Martha Nussbaum, actually a lot of people talk about this case, Iphigenia et Aulis. So Iphigenia was the daughter of Agamemnon. Agamemnon was fighting a war with Troy. He wanted to get his ships over to Troy so that they could fight, right? But he pissed off, I think it was Poseidon or somebody. Anyway, he pissed off some of the gods, okay? And they wouldn't let his ships move, right? So there he is. He's got thousands of soldiers, stuck on the ocean. He can't do anything with them. What's he going to do? Well, the gods say, sacrifice your daughter, Iphigenia. If you kill your daughter, if you sacrifice her to us, then we will release your ships. Your sailors will be safe. You can go off and fight your war in Troy, right? Problem solved, right? Okay. So there's sort of the question of what he should do, right? And when I presented this, I cleaned up the case a bit so that we have to imagine that Agamemnon is really a nice dad, okay? He really loves his daughter. He does not view her instrumentally, okay? He's heartbroken at this choice that he has to make, okay? But there's like one daughter and thousands of sailors. So he decides, that he's going to kill his daughter in order to save them, okay? So let's just assume that that is, all things considered, the right thing to do, okay? And make the number of sailors as large as it has to be, okay, for that to be the case. Okay, so Agamemnon, so Agamemnon does what's all things considered the right thing to do when he kills his daughter. Okay, right? And we sort of think, at least I thought, if you do what's all things considered the right thing to do, you can't be blamed for that. You can't be blamed for doing what's all things considered the right thing to do. However, it also seems to be the case that Agamemnon is apt for forgiveness. Okay. So in other words, it's on the table for Iphigenia to either forgive him or not forgive him. Right? That seems intuitively plausible to me as well. Like he can go to her, he can say, I really regret this. This is terrible, and then she can say, I hate you, jump off a cliff and not forgive him. Or she can say, I understand, I forgive you. But, either one of those responses is completely apt, right? But what that means is that forgiveness is something which is on the table there, okay? And then there's another claim, and this is what I was mainly writing about in this original paper. Forgiveness functions to render blame inapt, right? So that seems to be, so what I was thinking of is we have these three claims, and they can't all be true, and so I was saying, well, that means that David Owens' account's got to be wrong. David Owens' account of forgiveness has to be wrong, or the function of forgiveness has to be wrong, okay, right? Because if Agamemnon is apt for forgiveness, but he's not blameworthy, right, then that means that forgiveness has to have some other function. That can't be the function of forgiveness. So originally I rejected 3, okay? But maybe I was wrong. I mean, maybe the one that should be rejected is the first claim, that an action is not blameworthy if it is all things considered the right thing to do. And so how do we understand that in the context of what I was talking about today? Well, if you look at your relationship norms, father-daughter relationship norms, like one super serious one is that you don't kill your kid, right? You don't kill your daughter, right? That it would be quite natural for someone to view that as a betrayal of the relationship, okay? And that's a very serious violation of a relationship norm, okay? So Iphigenia is entitled to blame Agamemnon, even though he did what was all things considered the right thing to do. Maybe Clytemnestra. That is right. Yeah, Clytemnestra would be, it's okay for her to blame Agamemnon as well, all right? There's a very serious violation of a relationship norm, even though they did with all things. Now, the interesting thing is, though, and my intuition is that I don't have the right to blame him. I can't blame him. But Iphigenia and Clytemnestra can blame him. Okay, so that's kind of a weird sort of thing, right? But one reason I thought this was kind of interesting is that there's been a lot of work on standing to blame and on how there are features of blame that seem to have this kind of positional feature to them. And so I was thinking, well, maybe this isn't as nuts as it sounds, I'm like, maybe this is just another aspect of this positionality, right? And so they can blame him, I can't. That's weird, but it's weird and interesting. Okay? So anyway, I think I'll stop there, and I'll stop there, and thank everybody for listening.